acid-base balance, which is all about pH. And to refresh your memory, our pH range is very narrow. Okay, 7.4 is normal, plus or minus 0.05. So anything less than 7.35, we call that an acidosis or an acidemia. Now, technically, there's a difference between these two words, but they're used sort of interchangeably by most. Okay, acidosis is your body has too much hydrogen ion, your body pH is too low. Acidemia, emia has to do with the blood. So, but usually when there's one, there's the other, because hydrogen ions very easily exchange between the plasma and other parts of the body. pH of greater than 7.45 is an alkalosis or an alkalemia. And as we'll talk about, this one is much more common than this one is because we have a tendency to produce acid anyway. All right. We also talked last time about buffers, in particular the bicarbonate, the carbonic acid bicarbonate buffer system that dissociates into CO2 and water. Okay. So what we're going to look at today is how does the body respond to a challenge to its acid-base balance. So we're going to look at the response of adding acid, and we're going to look at the response to adding base. Okay, so the first one is the response to an acidosis. Now, in your book, it says a metabolic acidosis. This is the response to any acidosis. Okay, we'll talk about the different types in a minute, but that isn't actually broad enough. Okay, so we start up here. We're going to add hydrogen ion to the system, to the body. Now, this can be from lots of different causes. Okay, it can be from increased acid production, like you have in intense exercise, like you have in poor blood flow, like you get in shock, where the cardiovascular system is not pumping adequate blood to meet the body's needs. You can get this from medications, particularly an overdose, will often contribute hydrogen ions to the system, as well as a whole bunch of different metabolic derangements. Okay, so this is a catch-all. But in the end, what we have is a challenge to the body's acid-base balance because there's increased acid production. There's increased hydrogen ions in the system. So as we'll see for both acidosis and alkalosis, the response involves two organs, the lungs and the kidneys, and then the buffer systems in between. Okay, because what the body defends is its pH, not the total number of hydrogen ions that are present in the system. Okay, so if you add a bunch of acid to a person, the pH in their blood, if they're healthy, is not going to change very much because the buffers are going to absorb all that. Now remember that buffers' capacity to absorb hydrogen ions is limited though. So if you add enough acid, just like you do in the laboratory, that color will change. Well, in the body, if you add enough, that pH will change. The pH will start to drop. Okay, so we add acid, and here's sort of the pivot point in this whole system is our now infamous equation, right? So carbonic acid, bicarbonate, here's hydrogen ion in the middle. And when we add acid to the system, it pushes this equilibrium this way. So that means in the lungs, more CO2 is coming out of the blood. The response of the body to that is to increase respiratory rate and depth. Remember when we talked about the respiratory system, I said we have a harder time getting rid of CO2 than we do getting oxygen, right? Excuse me. So the rate limiting step for our system is how effectively we can get CO2 out into the air around us. So when there is an increase of acid in the body, the pH transiently goes down, and that drives the respiratory rate up. Excuse me. As we breathe more, effectively what happens is CO2 is pulled this way. It's pulled into the lungs and out, and that pulls this whole equation this way, which effectively gets rid of hydrogen ions, right? Because we're using those to make this water, and then we free up the CO2, which then leaves the system. So that's point number one. We increase our respiratory rate to get rid of extra CO2 and therefore hydrogen ions. Now, the kidneys are also involved in this though. As your pH level goes down, the kidney starts secreting hydrogen ions directly. So this is only the kidney can do this. And that is to secrete just the proton, to move the hydrogen ion out of the body and into the urine so that it'll be eventually removed from the system. In the process of creating this hydrogen ion, the kidney also creates a molecule of bicarbonate. Okay, this is a key point because we get sort of two effects for one change. So the kidney dumps a hydrogen ion, right? That's what we're trying to get rid of. But the kidney also creates a bicarbonate ion, which feeds into this system, attaches to a hydrogen ion, becomes a water, so it's neutralized as the CO2 leaves. So we get rid of two hydrogen ions for every one hydrogen ion the kidney secretes. So it's a 2 for 1. More on that in a minute. So we have the generation of bicarbonate. And then the body also always maintains a reserve of sodium bicarbonate all the time. So we can handle an acid challenge for a little while because of this bicarbonate reserve that we have. Because remember, for every bicarbonate ion, we can get rid of a hydrogen ion through the lungs. Okay. Now, in the meantime, not only the bicarbonate buffer system is active, but those other buffer systems are too. So the protein buffer system, the phosphate buffer system, those ones that we talked about last time, are working to stabilize pH even as the lungs and the kidney get rid of this extra acid that's coming from any number of different places. All right. So because what the kidney does in response to acid is really quite remarkable in terms of efficiency and effect, we are going to zoom in and look just at what's happening in the kidney. So this happens in the distal convoluted tubule mostly. It can also happen down here in the collecting system. And this is a variable effect. So the kidney is not doing this all the time. It's only doing this when the pH is too low or when there's extra acid being generated somewhere. Now, what exactly does it do? The magic happens in this division between the two directions. Okay, this is tubular fluid. This is going to become urine, right? So this is leaving the body. This is extracellular fluid. You can also think of this as the blood, because the blood and this fluid compartment are in constant exchange. So as the blood changes, this compartment changes. Okay, so what happens? Well, CO2 enters these cells, always plenty of that around, right? Renal tubule cells, just like all other cells in the body, produce some CO2 as well. So they have a local supply. We have a water, because we always have water around. We add those two things together, we get carbonic anhydrase. This should look very familiar, because we've seen it a bunch of times, right? Well, it's this last step is where the magic happens. So this carbonic acid is broken down, and the two parts are shoveled in two different directions. This is the tricky bit for, biochemically anyway, and we're not going to get into all the steps here, but the hydrogen ion is pumped into the urine, the bicarbonate is pumped into the extracellular fluid, and eventually into the blood. So we dump a hydrogen ion, we gain a bicarbonate, right? Just like what is said here. This is how this bicarbonate is generated, is by breaking down water and CO2, two things we have plenty of anyway, and sending their products in different directions. Now, because hydrogen ion secretion is so important in this equation, there's actually 3 different pumps in the renal cell that does this. One is the sodium-potassium pump, is modified and reversed, right? Usually potassium is pumped in, sodium is pumped out. Well, in this pump, it's been flipped, and instead of pumping potassium, it pumps a hydrogen. So we exchange a hydrogen ion going out for a sodium going in. Not a bad exchange, right? Because sodium, we have a bunch of systems to deal with. So we'd rather have an extra sodium ion than an extra hydrogen ion that could affect pH. So we get a good exchange there. We have a proton pump similar to what we have in our gastric mucosa that creates stomach acid, that pumps this hydrogen ion out directly. And then we have a hydrogen chloride pump as well, that pumps both a hydrogen and a chloride at the same time. So that's hydrochloric acid, right? So this is one of the reasons why urine is almost always acidic, is because of this hydrogen ion pumping that's happening all the time. Now you might say, well, why isn't it neutral? Number one, our bodies make metabolic acids. Number two, there's acid in the food that we eat. You know, it depends on your diet. You can drive your urine into alkalinity with changes in your diet, which is sometimes done for the purposes of treating certain kidney diseases. But typically, we're getting this pumping action. And then on the opposite side, we have a bicarbonate chloride pump. One goes out, one goes in. And we have a bicarbonate sodium pump. So we get a sodium bicarbonate that is pumped out. But in total, we take two things we have plenty of, split them, send the hydrogen ions one way, bicarbonate ions another way, and then these same bicarbonate ions feed into this system where a second hydrogen ion is removed as the CO2 is blown off. So, as long as your respiratory system and renal system can keep up with the extra hydrogen ion that's produced from whatever the disorder is, your pH doesn't change. Okay, now, and this happens in patients. So, for example, in COPD, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, the patient's ability to get rid of CO2 gets worse and worse and worse. So their CO2 level gets higher and higher and higher. And as long as that happens slowly over time, the kidney adapts and it starts taking over this role of the lungs to get rid of these extra hydrogen ions that are caused by this system backing up. So their urine gets more and more acidic, and they have normal pHs, even though their breathing is terrible. Now the problem is then you add another injury, like a pneumonia, to that, and the system is already doing as much as it can. So a patient like that, they very quickly get very, very sick because they're already using all of their reserve systems just to stay normal. So that's one example. Another example is in diabetes, which is not a respiratory issue. The body produces more and more acid because the glucose can't get into cells, so the body's using its other fuel sources, producing acid. And what you'll see in these patients is their urine gets more and more acidic too, and they breathe deeper and faster. So one of the classic signs of a diabetic who's in acidosis is they're breathing very deeply and very rapidly, even though they're not exercising. You know, they're just sitting there doing nothing, but they're breathing real fast. And they're getting rid of that extra acid by blowing off more and more CO2. And so their breath also has a smell. It smells like acetone. It's kind of a fruity smell, like nail polish remover. Because also along with the CO2 comes the ketones that their bodies are producing to keep the cells alive. So more on that in another course, but just to give you some examples. All right. In the case of alkalosis, we have kind of the opposite. You know, the arrows go in opposite directions, and the kidney changes its tune. Okay, so you can get an alkalosis by two reasons. One is removing hydrogen ions some way. One example of this is at the beginning of a vomiting illness, you know, patients will vomit, and out with that comes hydrogen ion, right? The stomach acid, hydrochloric acid comes out. You also see this in patients suffering from bulimia, self-induced vomiting, same thing. You get acid coming out. Another way you can get an alkalosis is by adding base. Okay, so some people who have chronic indigestion or heartburn, they literally will chew Tums all day long, right? Well, Tums is a base. It's an antacid. So you do a lot of that, and you can drive yourself into alkalosis that way, too. So what happens? In any case, we have... That's okay. I'm like, somebody's talking. So in the case of removing hydrogen ions, we get into an alkalosis, right? A pH that's too high. The body responds a couple ways. The first and fastest is respiratory. As the pH goes up, respiratory rate and depth go down. So we breathe less often and less deeply when our pH is starting to rise. What that accomplishes is less CO2 leaves at the lungs, and this equation backs up now towards this way, right? Less breathing means more hydrogen ions from the respiratory system. Do you see that? So as this goes up, it offsets this removal or neutralization, whether it's from removing acid or adding base. So that's the first thing that happens. The bicarbonate ion that's produced by this direction of movement is plenty happy. These bicarbonate ions, they don't really need a hydrogen ion around to exist because there's always plenty of sodium to balance out the electrochemistry there. So that doesn't matter. And then in the kidney, it switches from generating bicarb and secreting hydrogen ions to secreting bicarbonate and generating hydrogen ions. Okay? So note the difference at the kidney between this, right? Hydrogen ions go out, bicarbonate is made. Here, bicarbonate goes out, hydrogen ions are made. See that difference? Okay. And where does this bicarbonate come from? It comes from this equation being pushed this way. So here, and it's going out here, also from the bicarbonate reserve. So if we zoom in and look at the kidney, yes?
Sorry, can you explain one more time the start there, how the removal of hydrogen starts?
How that can happen?
Yeah.
You're either losing hydrogen ions out to the world somehow, like in vomiting, or in big diarrhea, or those hydrogen ions are being neutralized somewhere. So that's the Tums example. You know, if you're putting a bunch of bicarbonate or carbonate in, that carbonate effectively removes hydrogen ions.
Okay, so it's a cause of removing hydrogen ions, not excess. Well, I guess excess base.
It's the same thing.
Okay.
Yeah,
okay.
yeah. Because there's always plenty of hydrogen ions around. When we add a base, they get neutralized and make water in something else.
Okay.
Yeah, good question. So in the kidney, this is one of those spots that is, like I said, really kind of remarkable. Okay, so in acidosis, look at the directions of carbonate and hydrogen ions. Okay, so acidosis, hydrogen ions go to the urine, bicarbonate go back into the body. In alkalosis, it flips. This is a neat kidney trick. Only the kidney cells can do this. So same equation, CO2 and water, plenty of that around, right? Carbonic acid breaks down, but now the pumps have switched membranes. So in this case, in the case of alkalosis, the hydrogen ions are pumped into the body through that proton pump, and the bicarbonate is pumped out in exchange for a chloride. So we have same equation, but because the products are going in opposite directions, we have an opposite effect. So here, we're making a hydrogen ion that helps to get the pH down to normal range, and we're getting rid of a bicarbonate, which has a tendency to increase pH. So we get another double effect in the case of alkalosis. So both of those effects will decrease the pH, which is what you see here. So we get rid of a base, and we create a hydrogen ion to offset this removal or neutralization. All right. So regardless of the cause of the acidosis or the alkalosis, we get these effects. Okay, so these 4 slides happen regardless of what makes your pH change. Okay. Now we put our toe in to a relatively complex part of the physiology and pathophysiology of taking care of patients, right? Acidosis is very common, so common that there's this whole elaborate algorithm for determining what kind of acidosis and what the cause of that acidosis is. You'll learn that in another class. It'll take weeks, right? So it's a very complicated thing. But in the end, we have 2 types of each of the pH derangements. So we have 2 acidoses, we have 2 alkaloses, okay? We have a respiratory acidosis, a metabolic acidosis, a respiratory alkalosis, and a metabolic alkalosis. Okay. Why the names? When it has respiratory in front of it, it means it's the lungs' fault. Something in the respiratory system is causing this. Okay, so for example, in a respiratory acidosis, we get this when the lungs are not adequately removing carbon dioxide. Now, there's lots of reasons for this. This is a bad pneumonia. This is an asthma attack that's gone on for a long time, a bad one anyway. This is chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. This is lung cancer. This is pulmonary edema from heart failure. Anything that keeps the lungs from ventilating, moving air, or any blockade to that respiratory membrane where CO2 has to cross from blood into air to leave, any of those is going to cause a respiratory acidosis. Another example is somebody whose airway is clogged, so a choking victim, or an overdose in a drug or a medication that turns the respiratory drive way down. So you see this in opiates, for example, not just in overdose, but even in the care of post-operative patients. You're giving pain medicines because patients in pain, those pain medicines cause the respiratory drive to go down, and lo and behold, their pH starts to go down because they're not breathing enough to keep up with their CO2 production. Okay? So we call those respiratory acidoses because it's the lungs' fault. There is a converse version, much less common. Respiratory alkalosis is where the lungs are removing too much CO2 compared to what the body's producing. The most common cause of this is psychogenic. In other words, panic attacks will do this. Hyperventilation is layman's term for this. So, you're freaked out, you're breathing real fast because your brain's on overdrive, and lo and behold, you start to drive your CO2 levels way down, your pH starts to go up, and eventually you'll pass out, turning the brain off for a little bit, which returns the breathing to normal, and then the patient's fine. That's the most common reason. You've all heard the breathe in a paper bag thing from TV. It actually does work because you're breathing in your own CO2 that way. So you can help to reduce that problem by rebreathing your own CO2. In rare cases, there are other neurologic problems that can cause a respiratory alkalosis, but essentially it's the opposite of this. The lungs are working harder than they should for whatever reason. Those are the two easy ones. Because the respiratory system is fairly easy to evaluate. You can do that with your eyeballs. You watch the chest move up and down, or you can do it with a stethoscope or x-rays, things like that. The metabolic versions of these are anything not the lungs. So it's the catch-all. So a metabolic acidosis is caused when we either have increased acid production or we have an addition of some acid other than carbonic acid in the system. So this might be lactic acid like you get in shock, where there's poor perfusion, poor blood flow, and therefore poor oxygen delivery. Keto acids are very common in DKA, is diabetic ketoacidosis. It's what happens when your insulin level is very, very low and your cells are essentially starving for glucose. They produce keto acids, which are in fact acids and cause metabolic acidosis. So that's every other cause. The metabolic alkalosis is similar. It's any cause that isn't the lungs. So it's the ones we just talked about. Vomiting takes acid out of the system. Adding alkaline molecules like the Tums chewer adds things in. I think your book talks about all four, but I left out the metabolic alkaloses and acidoses because you're going to learn much more about them in a better way later on in your lives. Okay, because there's the easiest way to deal with metabolic acidosis and alkalosis is with algorithms. You look at some labs, you plug them into an algorithm, and it shows you what the likely culprits are. And you'll do that in another class. But I will talk a little bit about the respiratory versions because it reinforces what we learned in the respiratory system when we talked about that. Okay, So here's the case of a respiratory acidosis. So for whatever reason, the lungs are not getting rid of all the CO2 the body is producing. And again, I gave you some examples of how that can happen. Basically, it's anything that makes the lungs not work like they should can cause a respiratory acidosis. And the CO2 backs up, so it pushes the equation this way. This hydrogen ion, these levels go up because the kidney can only get rid of so much acid. And when the lungs are not working properly, there's this huge acid load from this backup of CO2 plus water, carbonic acid, hydrogen ion, and bicarbonate. So this number goes up and up and up. And we see it change very rapidly. For example, let's say you held your breath for a full 2 minutes and you measured your pH every 30 seconds along the way. You would see your pH go down for every 30 seconds. It happens very rapidly. So if we don't get rid of CO2 fast enough, this backs up. So it's kind of what we have talked about before. Now, over time, let's say this happens slowly over 6 months, like you'd see in COPD. Well, the kidney can dramatically increase the amount of acid it can secrete here, but only over time, because these transporters take time to be made and take time to function as rapidly as they can. So a respiratory acidosis can be compensated by changes in the kidney. But for every compensation that's made, the patient is closer to that cliff of falling off where there's nothing more the body can do. Their pH plummets. They go unconscious. They need massive, intensive care at that point. So we discriminate the two respiratory acidosis into compensated versus uncompensated. So if I gave you a whole bunch of morphine real fast and you stopped breathing because your brain stops caring about breathing at that point, that would be an uncompensated respiratory acidosis because it happened real fast. The kidney can't adapt, okay? But if you had a long-term respiratory illness like a slow pneumonia, you might be in compensated respiratory acidosis instead, okay? So to put that in one of our now infamous homeostasis diagrams, right? So here we are at normal. You hypoventilate for whatever reason. Say it's a medication, say you've got something blocking an airway. Your CO2 goes up, so your PCO2 in your blood goes up. That causes a fall in your pH. What happens? Well, the respiratory system tries to compensate. So the respiratory rate is increased, the depth is increased. You also get increased blood flow to the lungs. In this case, to try to get more blood to the lungs to accommodate the lungs that aren't working as well. The kidneys, if there's time, they compensate by producing hydrogen ions, generating bicarbonate ions, and then the buffer systems do their best to keep the pH normal. But that isn't going to last very long, particularly not in a respiratory acidosis. The lungs get rid of a boatload of hydrogen ions for us every minute, every hour of every day. So it doesn't take very long with a respiratory illness for your pH to start to go down. And to show you how important this is, the decision to put a patient on a ventilator, on a breathing machine, is pretty much always determined by their pH. Because if it was just oxygenation, we can give you a boatload of oxygen. We can put a 100% oxygen mask on. We can put a CPAP machine on to blow oxygen into your lungs. But what we can't do is get CO2 out of you any faster. So usually the decision to put somebody on a breathing machine is because their pH has fallen to 7 or below, and the only way to help them is they have got to move more air in and out of their lungs. So we do that. All of these things cause a decrease in CO2 and a decrease in hydrogen, and eventually we get back to normal. That's if we fix the respiratory problem in the first place, right? Or we've put the patient on a ventilator. Now, just a little clinical side point. Ventilators are not the save-all, end-all. You cannot fix every respiratory problem with a ventilator. So, do you remember the respiratory membrane? We had air over here in the alveoli, right? blood over here in the alveolar capillaries, and then we had the wall of the alveoli, the wall of the capillary, and the basement membrane in between. Sounds familiar, I hope, right? All a ventilator does is dramatically increase the air going in and out of the lungs. Let's say you have something like SARS. Do you remember SARS from the news? Sudden acute respiratory syndrome, I think it was. It came from a virus that was coming in from overseas. Well, in that disorder, what happens is this. So here's blood. So the respiratory membrane gets all thick because of edema, extra fluid in the lungs, and that serves as almost a blockade for CO2 to get from blood into air. So in those patients, you can put them on a ventilator, you can have them breathe 80 times a minute at their full lungs capacity, and it won't make a difference. Their pH will still keep falling because the CO2 can't get from the blood into the air. So that's a case where in extreme, sometimes those patients just die. But one extra thing you can do if you think that they're almost better and tomorrow they're going to be fine is you can put them on a machine that takes blood out of their body, runs it through an oxygen, carbon dioxide filtration membrane, then puts it back in. It's called ECMO, extracorporeal membrane oxygenation. It's about as extreme life support as you get, which some of you will get to see working with patients in the hospital. Okay, so a little clinical asides. Acidosis is totally a real clinical thing. Okay, so you really are going to see patients in this spiral, somewhere in this either circle. Circles are fine. Circles you can fix. Spirals, you can't always fix, right? Okay. So what about the opposite? Respiratory alkalosis. It works just the opposite way. So as more and more CO2 is pulled out, this equation gets pulled this way. That causes the hydrogen ion concentration to go down, which makes your pH go up. And like I said, it's usually psychogenic. Some drugs can do this. It's also much, much easier to fix. It's easier to turn somebody's breathing down than it is to help them breathe better. So oftentimes a little sedative is all you need for respiratory alkalosis. And this just shows you what happens in the body. So you've got, some hyperventilation. You're breathing faster than you need. Your pH goes up. The respiratory system responds by breathing less vigorously. That causes an increase in CO2, and we're back to normal. If for some reason this were to go on a long time, like you've had a brainstem injury, let's say, and your respiratory centers are in overdrive for months, well, the kidneys will compensate for that. They'll generate more hydrogen ions. They'll dump more bicarbonate ions. In that case, the patient would have a very basic urine, a pH of 8 or even 9. And those two things will offset that original increase in pH. And you'll be back to normal even though your kidneys are compensating, which makes you a little more brittle. All right. So some questions. Which of the following best fits metabolic alkalosis? Metabolic alkalosis. I heard C. Anybody else? Something nods to C. Yeah, the best one there is C. Consequence of prolonged vomiting. It actually occurs early in a vomiting illness because, let's say somebody's got nasty food poisoning, right? And they're vomiting in extreme. Well, by the third or fourth vomiting event, they're pretty much going to be empty of stomach acid anyway. So you see this effect early rather than late. These other ones, okay, tissue hypoxia. This is shock. Somebody has either lost a lot of blood or they're have a massive infection, so the body isn't getting enough circulating oxygen. The response to that is just like anaerobic exercise. We produce lactic acid as the body struggles to make ATP. So that acid, that lactic acid causes a metabolic acidosis. Consequence of hyperventilation, which one would that be?
Respiratory alkalosis.
Respiratory alkalosis. Everybody get that? Right? Because it's the lungs' fault. And then D, reduced alveolar ventilation would be A. Respiratory acidosis. Good. Good. And you will see this one. Of all of those four, the one you'll see most commonly is respiratory acidosis, because our ability to get rid of CO2 is adequate, but that's it. It's not superior in any way. So anytime you have a significant respiratory illness, you can get a respiratory acidosis. The second most common one you'll see is a metabolic acidosis, and that's where you have this giant algorithm, because there's like 157 different causes for metabolic acidosis. But you'll learn about those later. Probably from me. Many of you anyway. Okay, so which of the following descriptions best fits respiratory acidosis? Respiratory acidosis. I heard C. Okay, let's go through each of them again. A we just saw. A is a alkalosis of what type? Metabolic. Good. B, consequence of hyperventilation. It's a final exam week. Is what? Respiratory alkalosis. Good. And C, that's the answer to this one. D, tissue hypoxia. Metabolic acidosis. Good. Good, good, good. All right. All of which you'll see. So, let's give you an example. Somebody presents to the emergency room. They've been flown in by helicopter because they were unconscious at the scene. Massive trauma, right? So it's an adult. Their blood pressure is 80/20. Their heart rate's 150. Do you think they're getting enough blood to their body? Probably not. That's a really low blood pressure for an adult, right? So anytime that happens, well, the body's cells continue to need oxygen even if there's been a major trauma. The truth is they need even more because they're struggling to stay alive, right? So as those cells starve for oxygen, they use whatever they can to stay alive, and they break down glucose and lactic acid is formed. That lactic acid builds up and you get a metabolic acidosis. So in very, very sick patients whether it's trauma or other causes of shock, you can have a beating heart and still be dying. And that's one of the ways you can still be dying is if your body is not getting enough blood flow, your cells are dying even though your heart's beating. So it's one of the reasons why we put big fat lines in people and we pump them full of fluids and we put blood in them is to get their circulating blood flow up so that this doesn't happen and doesn't kill them. The brain is very sensitive to this. So even if your heart never stopped, if you had a low blood flow condition for more than 5 or 10 minutes, you may have brain damage at the end too, or a stroke. So minutes matter. That's why they fly them in by helicopter. And that's why if you see an ambulance with its lights on, please get out of the way, because there really could be somebody in there who needs it. All right. That's it. So questions about fluids, electrolytes, acid base. In my opinion, this is one of the most clinically relevant chapters of all this, our whole 2 semesters together. Because in practically every patient you're going to treat in the hospital, you're going to be worried about all 3 things. You're going to be worried about their fluid status and what to do about it, their electrolytes and what to do about it, and particularly in your sick patients, their pH, their acid-base balance and what to do about it. All right. Okay, no questions. I'm moving on. I'll introduce the reproductive system and then we'll call it a day. And of all the chapters, this is the one students ask the most questions about. So I'm ready. Ask away. I have time built in. Over the years I've learned you have to build in extra time for questions. Lots of questions on this. Okay. So your book, I think, starts with the male and then does the female. So that's how I adopted to do it. So as an overview, and we'll talk about each of these in turn. We're going to talk a fair bit about the gonads in both the male and female. Okay, so the gonad is where the germ cells are produced. And by germ cell, I mean those special cells in the body that have only half the normal genetic material that evolved to combine with another germ cell to create a full intact human cell different from both mom and dad, right? So this has a proper, gonad is a very specific term. It's where those germ cells are produced. Now in the human and every other species I'm familiar with, the gonads also produce reproductive hormones too. So they serve both roles. They produce the germ cell and they are endocrine organs to produce and support reproductive function and fertility, right? We have the accessory organs. So the testis in the male produces sperm. The accessory organs add to that sperm all of the things that sperm need to be fertile, okay? So, and provide a path from the testis through the urethra and out the end of the penis, right? So we have the ductus deferens. They connect the testis down here with the rest of the duct system, as we'll talk about in a minute. So from epididymis at the back of the testes to the prostate gland, which we talked a little bit about in the urinary system chapter, right? The seminal vesicles add fluid secretion to the sperm solution that it basically does one part of activating the sperm, getting them to swim. It also adds some volume, okay, so that the sperm have room to separate from each other. The prostate gland secretes a fluid and some enzymes that improve fertility. And then the bulbourethral glands provide a small amount of lubricant. The urethra is shared between the urinary system and the reproductive system, like we talked about before. And then the epididymis, which should be at the top of the list, it sits here behind the testes, and it's the place where sperm are stored and sperm mature. Okay, so without some time in the epididymis, sperm are not fertile. Okay, and the scrotum is the muscular sac that holds the testis, and we'll talk about a little bit later about why that is true. Why are the testes outside the body? It has to do with temperature, which we'll talk more about later. All right. For the male, this is one of the most useful views of the male reproductive tract because it shows all the pieces. From the front, you can't see the third dimension of it. It looks much simpler than it actually is because there's a front and back to this as well. Okay, so many of those same organs are here. So this is the urinary bladder, right? Here's the testis. Behind the testis is the epididymis. The epididymis at the bottom of the ductus deferens begin, and they go all the way up and around. And there again, you can't see this very well, but they go up and around this way, and they go forward and backwards this way. So they make kind of an S shape. And they have a long journey. The ductus deferens is one of the longest tubes in the male body. All right, so they come around, the ductus deferens come around here. They join with the seminal gland, which is right here. Together, these two ducts from the seminal gland and the ductus deferens, they join together to form the ejaculatory duct, that's right here, which joins with the urethra, which we talked about in the urinary tract chapter here. This gland surrounding both of those, this is the prostate gland. And then the urethra follows the path all the way out. And the bulbourethral gland is right here. It's actually after the urethra passes through the pelvic floor, the muscles in the pelvic floor right here. And we'll talk about some of this other anatomy as we go later Okay, so we'll stop there because this is a more complicated topic. Don't have time, but we'll pick it up there tomorrow. All right.